This is a reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15, and chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. Chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took the curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." Chapter 21. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, "God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The word of the Lord.
Two weeks ago in the Easter Sunday sermon, I talked about the darkness that enveloped Mary Magdalene and the others who went to the tomb. They brought spices with them to prepare Jesus' body according to the customs of the day. It was still literally dark as dawn approached, and it was also metaphorically dark, as they were surrounded not just by dark skies, but by the darkness of the upheaval of their whole world, represented, of course, most especially by the suffering and death of Jesus. And they were confused and saddened and heartbroken. And so, recognizing that darkness, I talked in the sermon about the darkness which envelops us right now. And I said that when you experience loss, it is okay and good and healthy to recognize that loss, to acknowledge it, and to do whatever you need to do to say that it stinks or makes you angry or makes you sad, or to punch a pillow, or to talk with a trusted friend, or to find some other way to acknowledge it and get it out. And so then we acknowledge the variety of losses that people are experiencing now with the public health crisis of the coronavirus. A public health crisis which has personal impact and community impact and worldwide impact. It impacts our health. It impacts how we relate to each other. It impacts our mental health. It impacts our economic well-being. Today's reading presents another story in which people have experienced a loss. Abraham and Sarah were without children. They were barren, or more specifically, Sarah was barren. The Bible presents children and the gift of children as coming from God, even directly attributing that sometimes as a blessing from God. And conversely, those who were without children often understood that as a divine withholding of blessing or a punishment or sometimes even a curse. There's a point in this story of Abraham and Sarah that Sarah says to others, "The Lord has prevented me from bearing children." With last week's story of Thomas, the disciple who was not with the others when Jesus appeared to them, and then who was the following Sunday. With that story of Thomas and with this story of Sarah and Abraham, we're beginning a new series around the theme Unraveled, seeking God when our own plans fall apart. This theme has been drawn together by the same creative folks at Sanctified Art who designed the What Can't Wait theme that we explored during Advent, and the Wilderness theme, which was our focus during Lent. So with Unraveled, we'll follow the stories of particular people in both the Old and New Testament, and we'll identify turning points in their lives in which they encountered a challenge and discovered something new about themselves or their identity or God's particular call to them. By immersing ourselves in these stories at a time when we ourselves feel unraveled, then we'll ask ourselves questions like, what happens when we feel our own world falling apart? How do we press onward when our tightly knit plans unravel into loose threads? What do we become when our identity or the path that we're on, when that comes undone? And how is God working in the midst of this unraveling? And we may over time discover, as we see ourselves in these stories, that sometimes life surprises us with unexpected joy, with love and with hope, with a new beginning that we couldn't have imagined. So these passages from Genesis 18 and Genesis 21, which make up today's reading, are sort of in the middle of the story of Sarah and Abraham. Earlier in the story, they're known as Sarai and Abram. And it's a story that develops over a long period of time. The beginning of the story is recorded in Genesis chapter 12. That's when Abraham is 75 years old. And the climax that we read today from chapter 21 is when Abraham is 100, so a 25-year span. Back in Genesis 12, God initiates a covenant, a promise with Abraham and to Sarah. It's a threefold promise of land, of descendants that would form a great nation, and the blessings that would come for all the families of the earth through them. All of these promises rest on the central promise of, you will have a son. Here's how God said it to Abraham, as recorded in Genesis 12. Abraham heard from the Lord, "Go from your country and your own kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Abraham was 75 years old. That's in chapter 12. We jump to chapter 15, and God repeats the central promise of a son. God says, "Your reward shall be very great." And Abraham speaks up, talking directly with God, saying, "God, it's not happening. Oh Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." This was a household slave. Abraham continues, saying, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be an heir." And God responds to this, repeating the promise or reaffirming the promise, and offers a physical sign. This man shall not be your heir, says God. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. And God brought Abraham outside and said, look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you were able to count them. So shall your descendants be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. As we turn to chapter 16 in Genesis, Sarah remains childless. And according to the customs of the day, she offers Hagar, a servant in the household, to Abraham as a surrogate. And later Ishmael is born to Hagar. And at this point, Abraham is 86 years old. It's 11 years after the initial promise. Moving to chapter 17, God reaffirms the promise. Abraham is now 99 years old. God says, I will make my covenant between me and you and will make you exceedingly numerous. And then God is specific about the promise of a son, once again reaffirming that central promise. I will bless her, Sarah, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. And Abraham is incredulous, and he laughs like Sarah later does. Abraham fell on his face, which is a sign of reverence, but he laughs, and he says to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham suggests that the promise might be fulfilled in his son by Hagar, saying, oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. And God continues to reaffirm the central promise that this son shall be born by Sarah. Your wife Sarah shall bear a son, and you shall name him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant. As we turn to the final section of today's passage, at long last the promise is realized. And Sarah bears a son and names him Isaac. And his name is a pun or a play on words for the word for laughter or for laughing. So how does this whole story come together in these passages? Sarah and Abraham continued to have this ongoing promise from God, and God reaffirmed it, but it still wasn't happening. The idea that they could become pregnant, that Abraham at 100 and Sarah at age 90 was so outlandish, so preposterous that they both laughed. First Abraham in chapter 17, and then Sarah in the passage we read today from chapter 18. Sarah's laughter is translated as she laughed to herself, but the Hebrew word here could also be translated she laughed inside of herself or in her guts. And so the phrase suggests that Sarah had this great big belly laugh. Or perhaps, as a Good Shepherd commentator Becky Erdman described this week, the actual text reads, Sarah laughed hysterically. So Abraham and Sarah were without children. And they received and they trusted God's promise, which was repeated or reaffirmed again and again, the promise that they would have a son. But it took so long, and it was just so preposterous at their ages. And yet ultimately, God was true to God's promises, but it took 25 years for ages 75 to 100 for Abraham for this to happen. And so what might this mean for us? I think the text invites us to wonder or to ponder about the unraveled state in which we find ourselves. And is it possible, as preposterous as it seems, that God could break in through the darkness that we are experiencing, that God might surprise us with moments of joy? In the culmination of this story in chapter 18, the divine messenger in the text asks, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Other translations put it, is anything impossible? Is anything too hard or too difficult for the Lord? It is marvelous. It is wonderful. It is astonishing, is how other English translations relate this passage. So know that it is okay. It is good. It is healthy to acknowledge and to lament when you have experienced a loss. And by trusting faith, even while it seems preposterous enough to cause you to have a great big belly laugh, maybe God is ready to surprise you with joy and with wonder. The story of Sarah and Abraham nudges us to hold open the possibility that sometimes, even after life seems to be falling apart, that God can surprise us and present us with unexpected joy if we are willing to receive it. While preparing for this week's worship, Deanna and I invited you to share some of the joyous surprises that you have experienced. So in a moment, as our worship video continues, you'll be able to see pictures and images that reflect that kind of joy. And first, let me take a moment to share a story provided by church member Sharon Hickox, who says it's okay to share this with you as a moment of surprise and great joy for her and for her family. She writes, many years ago when I was pregnant with my son, later to be born, we were members of a church in Midland, Texas. The associate pastor preached a sermon on this very passage. We really loved his preaching, and we didn't get to hear him preach too much. And that day's sermon was so moving to me and such a wonderful gift of joy and laughter that I decided then and there that I would name my son Isaac. Thanks be to God for moments of surprise and joy and laughter. Amen.